Last year, at the beginning of June, my grandparents asked if I could house sit for them while they were away. They're real active in their old age. Since they've retired, they like to go on these 3 months long road trips around North America in their RV. They offered me some money to boot, and the promise of easy cash isn't something I often turn down, especially not when I'm unemployed. Plus, getting to spend a couple months in a nice 2-story house down by the beach? Everything was lining up for a chill, awesome summer. A couple of days before I was set up to take residence in my grandfolks' home, my mom came into my room while I was packing. She touched me on the shoulder and said a little weakly, "You know you can always come home if you change your mind." "I know, Mom," I replied, a little puzzled. She hugged me around the waist and put her head on my chest. "I love you, kid," she murmured. I thought she was just being overly emotional about not seeing me for the next few months. In retrospect, I thought of a lot of the things that turned out to be wrong. By the time I got to my grandparents' house, they had already started on their trek around the country. There was a note on the dining room table telling me about where to find grocery stores in their neighborhood, some pretty good restaurants, cool things happening at the beach in the next few weeks. Pretty basic stuff. There was just one weird sentence at the very end. "If you see anything that looks amiss, it's probably that way for a reason." I would have never have thought to connect those words for what they ended up pertaining to. But at the time, the strangeness of the phrase didn't even register me. I was just upset that they forgot to leave their Wi-Fi password. Then I remembered that they still use DSL, and that I had to plug in my laptop to be able to use the internet. What is it about even the hippest grandparents just being so behind, and that it leaves just one inconvenience for you? The first night at their place was pretty chill. I watched some TV and strolled around their neighborhood. It was one of those part beach, part forest kind of places, like someone stapled Bringington Beach into the middle of Montana. It was past dark when I got back, and I figured I might go to bed early and try to do some more exploring in the morning. I'm not usually a nature calls kind of guy, but when in Rome. After I locked up and turned off all the lights on the first floor, I went upstairs to do the same for the second floor, when I noticed something peculiar. My grandparents have left the light on in the guest room. Easy enough to make a mistake like that, I figured. Who doesn't forget to turn the light out in a room every so often? I flicked it off and went to sleep in their bed across the hall. I was willing to push the idea of sleeping somewhere that had hosted grandparent sex out of my head in order to take advantage of their comfy queen-size bed. A digression, but an important one. Me and my mom never slept over at our grandparents' house when I was young. Well, that's not entirely true. The rare nights that we would sleep over, we would sleep in their RV. Me in the bed and her on the couch. I didn't think much of it at the time, since getting to sleep in a big car is something any little boy would find perfectly agreeable. The novelty wore off as I got older, though. And when I was 13, I asked my mom if we could just sleep in the guest room the next time we visit. "Maybe, sure," I remember her muttering. I hadn't visited my grandparents since. Sometimes they would come to see us for important events like birthdays and graduation and stuff like that. But I haven't slept over on their grounds for nearly a decade before I took this house-sitting job. Now, as I said, the first night was perfectly chill. You could even extend that statement to account for the first week. I took in the beauty of the nature, vegged out watching YouTube clips on their mediocre DSL connection, even met a couple of girls down on the beach. I didn't expect them to call me, but sometimes just the fun of flirting can make up for the lack of results, at least for me. The grandfolks had a big collection of old Flash comics from the 50s and 60s in their guest room. So sometimes I'd end the night by reading a stack of them, shutting the light out, and going to bed. Again, a perfectly normal, unremarkable first week. Then I heard the whistling. I was up in my grandparents' bedroom, cruising around the internet at 2:30 in the morning. That's when the internet connection is the best. I think I was reading a cracked article about funny video game glitches when I heard a very soft but very distinct, high-pitched noise for about 3 seconds. I don't think I even turned my head when I heard it, thinking it must have been some goofy night bird. But then an hour later it started again. It was too tuneful, too specifically melodic to have come from a bird. And it must have lasted for at least a solid, uninterrupted minute. I thought maybe an ad was playing on my laptop, but I checked the speakers and they were turned off. Right as I started to rise out of my chair, the whistling faded out. Almost like an inappropriate laugh does. I closed my laptop, locked the door of the room and went to bed, unnerved. The next couple of nights I had gone to sleep early. But 4 nights after I heard the whistling for the first time, it happened again. I was lying in bed at 2:45, trying to go to sleep, when the same tune as before started looping. But it was a little louder than last time, and it didn't stop. I knew I wasn't imagining it. It responded to the acoustics of the hallway the same way I heard any voice do the same when I was younger. The sound wasn't only real, it was in the house, right on the other side of the wall. I was rigid in bed, too freaked to even breathe, until the sound came up after a grueling 5 hours. Where have I heard that song before was the only thing I had in my head when I woke up from a miserable sleep. I walked around the beach whistling to myself in frustration for a couple of hours before it finally hit me. The Dock of the Bay by Otis Redding. Something in my grandparents' house had been repeating the whistle refrain from the Dock of the Bay all night long. I went back immediately and checked all the windows on the second floor. They were locked tight. My grandparents had a security system, so I couldn't imagine anybody getting in very easily. But even if someone had broken in, they didn't take anything. Who would go to the trouble of bypassing a security system just to walk up to the second floor, stand in one place, whistle the Dock of the Bay for hours, and then leave when the sun came up? Unless they didn't leave. I ran down to the kitchen to grab a knife and then scrambled to search every room and every closet, looked under every bed, checked behind the drawers and under the couch and behind the TV. Nothing to suggest anyone besides myself had been there over the past couple of weeks. Nothing except the whistling. That night I mustered up my courage and decided to try something, an experiment. I stayed on the internet around 3 a.m. Sure as shooting, I started to hear the whistling again. And just like last night, it was the same song and louder than it was the previous night. Now almost to the volume of a full, normal voice. After the refrain was repeated a couple of times, I mashed the whistle. As soon as the first half of the riff ended, the high part, I whistled as clearly as I could imagine the second half, the low part. After I matched the whistle, there was silence for a moment. Then the whistling came back, but it was not the Dock of the Bay, and it was not quiet. It started out at an even pitch, very low, lower than I thought it was even possible to whistle. Then slowly the pitch rose over a couple of minutes, higher and higher and higher until it turned into a piercing screech. It was not even an even tone now. It was stop and start, almost like someone was belting it out after every short, sharpened breaths. And it was ear-splitting high. Worse still, the notes got slightly louder and slightly quieter over the course of the night, in rapid intervals, which led me to believe that whatever was doing this was running up and down the hallway, passing in front of my door every few seconds. But I never heard footsteps. I never saw a shadow under the door. This furious, oscillating scream lasted for hours and hours. I sat in the far corner of the room, clutching my knife and covering my ears, keeping my eyes clamped shut. Right, I was considering killing myself, just so the noise would stop tormenting me. The sun began its ascent over the beach, and the siren noise faded away. I slept for 3 useless, nightmare-riddled hours. I knew my mom had lived in the house until she was old enough to leave home, and as far as I knew, my grandparents had lived here most of their lives. They had to have known about this nightmare, this haunting. How have they been able to tolerate it? And if they knew they had some horrible paranormal entity residing on their grounds, why had my grandparents kept asking us to come back over and over throughout the years? These were my questions I asked myself all day. I tried to spend as much time on the beach as possible that day, even tolerating the overpriced burgers at the snack shack, just so I wouldn't have to go back to the house and make something. In my mind, I reasoned that my mom and grandparents had to do something to make that place livable. They had to have found a way to coexist with whatever lived there too. Then I remembered the light in the guest room. Everything made sense all of a sudden. I went back and turned the guest room light on, just for safety. I turned on every single light on the top and bottom floor. My understanding of whatever this thing's logic was led me to believe that it couldn't come out if the lights were on. And since it lived in the guest room, it wouldn't be able to leave if the lights were on everywhere. Even though I'd have to adjust to sleeping with the lights on in my grandparents' room, I figured I'd find a way to make this thing's presence a non-issue. My grandparents could just deduct the whopping electric bill out of my salary for all I care. It happened later than it happened before, at 4 in the morning and at a boisterous volume. The next song I decided to whistle was the vocal melody to My Favorite Things from The Sound of Music. Not only did it change its tune, It lulled me into a false sense of security, thinking that I had beat it after it failed to show up at the same time it did in the past. But it whistled, and the lights burned on, and the sun rose, and I gave serious thought to drowning myself in the ocean. Maybe it was a mistake to have engaged it, and that was why it wouldn't leave now. Even with the lights on, maybe when I addressed it, I invited it into the house proper. I never figured out for certain, but I was never able to make it stop. I didn't make the mistake of responding to it for a second time, so it never changed songs again, and it always started around 4 in the morning, my favorite things, all morning, every morning, as performed by a murderous, wrathful spirit. For a while, I came up with a consistent way to bypass it. I would just go to sleep early and pray to God I didn't wake up to between 3 and 4. And that actually worked for a little while. If I went to bed around 10 and slept through the night, I didn't hear the whistling and no harm came to me. For the most part, this idea worked for me for a couple of weeks. Then one morning around 9 a.m. in the middle of July, I woke up and my door was open, just a crack. I had shut and locked my door every single night for a month. I remember the sound of the door shutting and the lock crackling every night before I went to bed, including the night that the thing had opened my door. Did it just stare at me while I slept? Did it sing me a lullaby? This was the last straw. I sat up and broke down crying. I had run out of strategies. I had run out of battle plans. I had run out of appeasements. Now this thing was just toying with me, mocking me, showing that it could just get to me whenever it wanted to, asleep or awake, lights on or lights off. What do you want? I screamed in agonized terror. What can I do? Nothing responded, of course. It was morning, and the thing wasn't out and about yet. To my knowledge, groggily, miserably, I dragged myself out of bed. When I got to the hall, I saw that the door to the guest room was cracked open as well. I'd kept it closed, locked from the outside for the last month like I had done to every other room. Why did it open that door too? What could it? Oh, of course. I understood now. I had a normal day. I ate my breakfast. I strolled through the woods. I took a great picture of the sunset over the ocean. And when I got back, I watched Adult Swim until 2 in the morning. Then I went up the stairs and got in my pajamas. I brushed my teeth, took a piss. I went into the guest room, got underneath the covers, and went to sleep. The whistling stopped completely. For the rest of the time I was at my grandparents' house, when my mom came to pick me up at the end of August, I told her I had a great time. On the drive back home, she told me that Grandma and Grandpa had sent me the money for the house sitting with a simple handwritten note that simply said thanks. She hadn't been able to get in contact with them over the phone for the last couple of weeks. But when she last called, they said they were in Colorado and having a great time. A month later, my grandparents had still not come back. A month later, the whistling started. I was in my bed trying to go to sleep when I heard Fly to the Moon, Frank Sinatra, just outside my door. I think my mom heard it too. I heard her crying. Not this. I think I heard her sob. Not here. Not again. Please. I saw my mom on the dining room table. The next morning, pale and haggard, she had not slept, looking at me with a mix of panic, exhaustion, and fear. It is an expression I imagine she wore many times when she was young. Kid, she whispered. What did you do? I looked at her, wanting to cry, heavy with guilt. Then I looked at the table. My money was on it, next to the envelope. And next to the envelope was my grandparents' note. Thanks. Oh no, kid. I simply understood why they invited us to sleep over so many times all those years ago. Thanks. Why they have always tried to make the guest room so it looked so neat, so clean for us. Why they assured us it was the most comfortable bed in the house. Thanks. And why I was so very sure that they would never come back home from their RV trip as long as they lived. What did you do?